You wake up in the dark, and something is wrong. Not because you heard a sound, because you didn't. No birds, no wind, no breathing beside you. For most of human history, silence like that meant one thing. Something was close, and it was being quiet on purpose. Around 300,000 years ago, at a site called Jebel Irhoud in what is now Morocco, people who looked essentially like you were waking up to that same silence. Every day. For their entire lives. A single day in the Stone Age wasn't dangerous the way the movies show it, with one dramatic monster in the shadows. It was dangerous, the way a tightrope is dangerous, constant, ordinary. One bad step, at any hour, could end everything. Here's what most people get wrong about that danger, though. It wasn't really the lions, or the wolves, or the woolly rhinos. Researchers, who study skeletal trauma, have found something stranger. The anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus examined dozens of Neanderthal skeletons and found injury patterns concentrated in the head, neck, and upper body. The closest modern comparison he could find wasn't soldiers. It was rodeo riders, people who spend their working lives at close range with large, unpredictable animals. That tells you something the horror movie version leaves out. Ancient danger wasn't about running from monsters. It was about grappling with your own dinner. A single hunt gone wrong, a single kick from an animal 3 times your weight, and a fracture that would sideline you for weeks in a world with no cast, no antibiotics, no ambulance. There's a related myth worth clearing up right here, because it gets repeated constantly online. The idea that ancient humans slept in one perfect, unbroken 8-hour block, the way wellness culture insists we're supposed to, doesn't actually hold up. The sleep researcher, Jerome Siegel, studied 3 different modern foraging and small-scale societies, the Hadza, the San, and the Tsimane, using actual wristband sleep trackers, not guesswork. He found no single universal ancestral sleep pattern at all. Total sleep time varied, timing varied, and none of the groups slept in one idealized block, the way some popular claims assume. So if a wellness video ever tells you your ancestors napped on some perfect biological schedule you're failing to replicate, that claim is thinner than it sounds. So, how did anyone survive childhood long enough to become an adult with old fractures to study in the first place? This is the detail that gets me every time. They didn't survive it alone. Researchers who study small-scale foraging societies today, like the Juhoansi of the Kalahari, use them as a working model for certain conditions of ancient life, not as some unchanged window into the past. The anthropologist Richard Lee spent months in the 1960s tracking exactly how the Juhoansi spent their time and calories. His numbers surprised almost everyone. Adults were only actively gathering or hunting food for roughly 20 hours a week. Not 60, not 80, 20. The rest of the day went to rest, to childcare, to conversation, to simply sitting together. That number has been debated since Lee first published it. And later, researchers have argued the real figure varied a lot depending on season and location. But even the more cautious modern estimates land nowhere near the exhausting, round-the-clock grind that pop culture imagines for cavemen. So let's reconstruct what a real day might have actually looked like, using that evidence as our guide. You wake before the sun, because the whole group wakes before the sun. There's no separate bedroom, no door that closes. Sleeping happens in a loose cluster, adults and children together, close enough to hear every shift and cough. A fire from the night before is coaxed back to life. And here's a detail that changes the whole picture. Much of the actual talking, planning, and storytelling doesn't happen during the workday at all. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner recorded and compared daytime and nighttime conversations among the Juhoansi and found something specific. Daytime talk was mostly practical, arguments, complaints, logistics. Firelight talk, after dark, was where the stories lived. Myths, history, jokes, gossip about people 2 camps over. Firelight, in other words, might be one of the oldest classrooms humans ever built. Not for facts, for culture itself. Back to the daylight hours, though, because that's where the real risk started. Foraging groups didn't hunt for meat every day, and when they did, it rarely went the way you'd picture. Big game hunting was often a long, patient, mostly unsuccessful pursuit, sometimes tracking an animal for hours before ever getting close. The anthropologist Kim Hill spent years documenting hunting outcomes among the Acha of Paraguay, and the numbers he recorded were sobering. On any given hunting trip, the odds of coming home with meat at all were often less than 50%. Think about that for a second. An entire day of tracking, walking, waiting, spent in genuinely dangerous proximity to large animals, and more than half the time, nothing. That's not a failure of skill. That's just what hunting actually looked like, most days, for most of human history. Meanwhile, the food that actually filled most stomachs on most days came from something far less cinematic. Plants, roots, nuts, tubers, seasonal fruit, insects, gathered mostly by women, in groups, over ground the gatherers had usually walked 100 times before. This is where a popular myth needs correcting on camera, because it's been repeated so often it sounds true. The idea that ancient life was man the hunter, woman the gatherer, full stop, no overlap, is much tidier than the actual evidence. Anthropologists now generally treat that division as a rough tendency, not a rigid law, and it varied enormously by region, by season, and by which group you're even talking about. A Kalahari forager and an Upper Paleolithic hunter in what's now France were not living identical lives just because both predate agriculture. Cold added its own layer of danger entirely, and it's easy to forget just how far north some of these groups were pushing. Archaeologists working at sites like Denisova Cave in Siberia have recovered tiny, finely made bone needles with eye holes dated to tens of thousands of years ago. That's not a detail to skip past. A needle that's small means someone was sewing tailored, layered clothing, not just draping a hide over their shoulders. The archaeologist Ian Gilligan has argued that fitted clothing may have been one of the single most important survival technologies of the Ice Age, letting groups push into brutally cold regions no bare-skinned mammal our size should be able to tolerate. Without it, a single bad night of exposure could be fatal, especially for the very young or the very old. And children weren't sitting at desks watching adults model every skill step by step either. The anthropologist Sheena Lou Levy has studied how children in modern forager communities actually pick up survival skills, and her research points somewhere unexpected. Most of it happened through play, and through watching other children only slightly older than themselves, not through direct instruction from adults. A 6-year-old learned to dig for tubers, mostly by copying an 8-year-old, who was copying a 10-year-old. Childhood, in other words, was its own quiet training ground, running in parallel to the adult world, mostly unsupervised, and apparently working well enough for tens of thousands of years. Back to the danger, because there was always more than one kind. Childbirth was one of the biggest. Skeletal and comparative evidence across many traditional societies suggests maternal mortality was a real and recurring risk, far higher than in places with modern obstetric care today. There was no epidural. There was no ultrasound to catch a problem early. There were, however, other women, experienced ones, who had done this before, who knew what a long labor looked like, and what to do about it. Support during birth wasn't a modern add-on. It was survival infrastructure. Some researchers, including the anthropologist Wenda Trevathan, have argued that human birth itself may have shaped this need, since a narrow pelvis paired with a large infant head makes solo, unassisted labor unusually difficult compared to most other primates. If that idea holds, it means the need for companionship during birth isn't just cultural. It may be written into human anatomy itself, going back hundreds of thousands of years. Illness carried its own quiet menace, too. No antibiotics meant a small cut could become a dangerous infection within days. And yet the fossil record keeps surprising researchers on this exact point. Some ancient skeletons show severe injuries, even amputations, that clearly healed, meaning someone was fed, protected, and cared for through a recovery that could have taken months. The clearest example might be a Neanderthal skeleton found at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, studied by researchers including Eric Trinkhaus, showing a man who had lost most of the use of one arm, was likely partially blind, and still lived for years afterward. He could not have hunted, and probably could not have gathered much on his own. Someone else was feeding him. That's not what survival of the fittest is supposed to look like, is it? Here's the twist that current research keeps circling back to, and it's the one that actually reframes this whole video. The old picture of prehistoric life, as short, brutal, and solitary, doesn't hold up well against the evidence. What holds up instead is a life that was physically dangerous, genuinely uncertain day to day, but socially dense in a way most modern lives simply aren't. You were almost never alone. Not while sleeping, not while eating, not while sick, not while giving birth, not while dying. The anthropologist Kristen Hawkes has argued that even grandmothers, past their own reproductive years, played an outsized role feeding and protecting grandchildren, freeing up mothers to have children again sooner. It's called the grandmother hypothesis. And while researchers still debate exactly how large its effect was, the basic pattern keeps showing up. Survival wasn't an individual sport. It was a group project, running 24 hours a day for your entire life. So here's the honest mirror, without stretching it further than the evidence allows. You don't face lions today. You probably won't fracture a rib wrestling an antelope this week. But the constant, background, low-grade uncertainty that defined that world hasn't disappeared. It's just changed shape. And the thing that actually buffered it back then wasn't toughness. It was proximity. People within arm's reach. At 3 in the morning, if something went wrong. Most of us now sleep behind closed doors, in separate rooms, sometimes in separate buildings from anyone who'd notice if we needed help. That's not a flaw in modern life. Privacy, quiet, a locked door. These are things people worked hard to get, and there's real comfort in them. But comfort and safety aren't always the same thing, and it's worth noticing what got left behind to gain the first one. For nearly the entire span of the human story, being surrounded, at every hour, by people who would notice if something went wrong wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was the only version of survival available. It's just a genuinely different trade-off than the one your ancestors were making, and it's worth sitting with what that trade actually cost, without pretending either version was simply better. You woke up in the dark once, and something felt wrong because of a silence. 299,900 and something years later, most of us wake up in a silence like that almost every single day, and don't think twice about it. Maybe that's the real difference between then and now. Not the danger, the distance we've put between ourselves and each other to survive it.